Planet Mission Part 1 by David Claiborne, as read by the author. New chapters every Monday. The full novel is available on Amazon.com and other online retailers. Links in the description. Chapter 18. The Clinic. The medical clinic sat empty except for its proprietors. It often sat empty. The result was a pair of listless, bored missionaries. A feeling that they were not doing their jobs plagued Jazzy and Waters, yet they were unwilling to adjust for fear that Mufasa would see improvisation as contributing to failure should the situation worsen. Better the mediocrity of familiarity than the unknown. Today was no different, except that the days were becoming hot. The PTFE shelter was good at keeping the elements out, which was part of the problem. The only air movement came from the zippered flap at the entrance. However, without an outlet, the air inside the shelter tended to stagnate even with the flap open. Behind the privacy screen that separated Waters' office in front from Jazzy's clinic and back, there was even less air movement. This tended to bring the pair into close proximity throughout the loathsome days. As soon as the sun hit the shelter, she sought respite closer to the door in Waters' office space. Today, she stood in the shelter door, arms crossed, and watched the colonists pass. "When is our next report due?" she asked. Waters was at his desk reviewing their mission training as he had done every day for weeks. He spun in his chair to face her. "It's past due. Mufasa wanted weekly updates. We have not been able to provide an update since we left the spaceport. The atmospheric interference is too strong here for us to contact Polus Station, let alone obtain a Li-Fi signal to report directly to Mufasa. Why do you ask?" Jazzy stood in the doorway, not moving, not really looking at anything, and not answering either. She was silent long enough that Waters turned back to his desk. "How many times are you going to review our training and mission parameters before you start to implement them?" she said. "What was that?" Waters asked, spinning his chair around again. "When are you going to stop flicking through our training and actually put everything that we were taught into practice?" she said, this time turning to face him, her arms on her hips. "Are you this mission's director or not?" Waters stared for a second. "You know very well that I am the director, and you also know that these colonists have been intractable. How many have come to see us? A half dozen at most? How many have come to your clinic, Dr. Beebe?" Jazzy shifted on the balls of her feet and stomped back behind the curtain to her clinic, drawing it sharply after. Waters turned back to his desk just in time for the curtain to fly open as Jazzy emerged again. "You realize that when the Li-Fi window opens, I will have no choice but to report to Mufasa and the administration the situation here as I see it. What do you think my role is?" "I will be doing the same. I'll report on the progress of each missionary, including the status of our clinic. What were your target numbers again?" "Who do you think is going to have credibility when they report?" "What are you implying? I am the director of this mission. It is my responsibility to make the report. I expect the missionaries to confine their communication to the areas for which they are responsible. And what about your responsibility? We all have specific tasks. Yours is to treat patients. How many have you seen so far?" "I could get better numbers than you in a second." "I'd like to see you try for once. You've had months to get someone in the clinic, anyone. And how has that gone for you?" "I'll bet my numbers will be better than your numbers." "You're on." They both stomped out of the clinic, Jazzy to the gate and Waters down the hill back to camp. He needed to strategize. She may have been out of line, but she was right. He had to show some measure of success before their Li-Fi window opened, even if it just meant increasing his number of contacts. Waters was breathing heavily when he arrived and felt dizzy. In his anger, he had forgotten that, as the colonists liked to remind them, he was still not accustomed to the moon's atmosphere. He had jogged too quickly down the hill in the heat of the day. He moved into the shadow of one of the shelters and rested his head on a water purifier. Taking a drink, he fanned himself with his hand and wiped the sweat from his brow. After a few minutes, he felt comfortable again. The last thing he wanted was to suffer heat stroke and need to have Jazzy treat him. He had to show that he was a strong director. He walked to the shelter he shared with Jazzy and resented it. He thought of the rover, which sat parked in the shade, but resented that too. He remembered it as a place where he and Jazzy had been too close together for too long, a space like what the clinic was now becoming. Not really knowing where to begin, he began to walk. He passed Junebug working outside his shelter. Most days, Tommy would be sitting with his feet kicked up on a crate next to Junebug, but he was nowhere to be seen for once. Junebug had yet to succeed in cultivating a vine, let alone growing one of the fruits, but he still worked happily and diligently. He had collected and propagated several other species. The bandages on his hands and fingers testified to fresh injuries from recent work. The Polus fruit, vites, which they all ate now, would heal him by the afternoon. Molly was in camp too, working at a bench opposite Junebug. "Hi, Alex," she said as he approached. "Good morning, Molly," he said. "What are you working on?" "The APOC is fascinating. Junebug's been helping me with the research." "She's not kidding," Junebug said, leaving his plants behind for once to join them. "I know I think everything is fascinating, but this really is. You know how the colonists have a mode on their glasses, the one we use to track the APOC?" Junebug said. "Of course." "Well, we think they use it almost exclusively to track APOCs," Molly said. "Wasn't it for gravitational anomalies?" Waters asked. "Yes, but that's part of what's fascinating. We think the APOC has some measure of control over gravity itself," Molly continued. "That's why it can be so hard to see. It doesn't just camouflage itself or have chromatophores like a chameleon. It absorbs and bends light, even feeds on it. Its physiology is different from anything we know. We think it may actually jump using its control of gravity. That's what creates the distortions and why it's so strong and fast," Junebug said. "It makes its own wormholes?" "Possibly." "So if it's not bending the light or jumping, the glasses wouldn't be able to spot it?" Waters said. "Probably not," Junebug said. "Doesn't that mean it could jump out of the pen?" Waters asked. Molly and Junebug looked at each other uncomfortably, and Molly said, "We're not sure why it hasn't already. The pen might act like a kind of Tesla cage and prevent it from leaving, but truthfully, we just don't know enough to say." "If it hasn't left on its own, then either it can't leave or it wants to stay," Waters said. "That's plausible," Junebug said. "I think we should still take precautions, maybe ask Tommy to keep his rifle handy." "That's not a bad idea, but I think we're probably safe. The chase and capture and the colonists' hunt probably agitated it. It's just an animal, remember. If it feels safe and well kept, it doesn't pose a threat. Have you seen Bo?" Waters finished. "Not today. He must be off shooting video," Molly said. "Good. I hope his edits are ready to transmit when the Li-Fi opens up. His last wildlife film was fantastic." "It really was," Junebug said. "The more success you all have, the better our report to Mufasa will be," Waters said. Walking past the shelters, Waters followed a path through the trees. It led to the clearing with the APOC's pen. It was quiet there. The clearing lacked the valley's characteristic birdsong and buzz of insects. The colonists were extremely hesitant to let them keep the APOC for study. "It is only because the knowledge you gain may yet help us that we will allow this," the mayor had said. That mayor. The colonists had absolutely refused to provide them an animal as food for the poor creature, even a deceased one. It ignored the food they gave it, only playing with the fish and shrimp they netted in the nearby river. It did not bother with its fodder at all. It had recovered from the stress and wounds of its capture, but still looked just as emaciated. Despite its refusal to eat, it looked no different or worse for wear. "Its physiology is different from what we know," Molly had said. Waters noted a couple of small animals, sciros the colonists called them, who must have wandered too close and been caught. Their skinned carcasses lay on the floor, but the APOC had not eaten the meat. The sight of the dead animals hurt Waters, but he reflected it was simply the way of nature. Humans knew better. Animals did not. The APOC sat on its haunches in the center of the pen, intent on something as Waters approached. Waters turned, following the APOC's line of sight, and flinched. Bo sat on a crate just outside the APOC's reach, but close enough to observe the creature. He was sitting so still that Waters had not seen him. "Oh, you startled me," Waters said. "I thought you would be off filming." Bo did not answer. "Mind if I stay a while?" He dragged an empty crate next to Bo's. He turned and was surprised to see that the APOC had moved right up against the wall of the pen while his back was turned. It was so close he could hear it breathe. The air from its long snout blew against the walls of the pen as its bony chest rose and fell. It stared at him, black eyes unblinking, limbs folded against its sides. Waters had to fight the urge to stare back. "On second thought, I think I'll find something else to do. You all right?" he asked Bo. Bo nodded. It was barely perceptible, but still a nod. "I'm fine, Alex. More than fine. I don't think I've been better this entire mission. You know, I really like this guy. I'm glad we didn't let the colonists kill it. Did you know that in the absence of higher authority, the self determines what is moral? He said, never taking his eyes off the APOC. That's what you've been thinking about? That's why we have the administration, Waters said. We are certain of what is right. That thinking is too narrow, Alex. Like the city gate, it leaves much out, Bo said. What if there were no administration? What if the administration were not there to pass judgment? What if the administration never knew someone's actions? What if no one ever knew? Isn't that why we have a conscience? The conscience is a construct of higher authority's influence and not native to the self. It only makes sense for the self to do what's best for the self. This conversation's a bit more philosophical than I'm in the mood for right now, Waters said. I need to get back to work. I'll see you later. Don't spend all your time here, okay? We have a mission to carry out. Waters avoided Jazzy's clinic the rest of the day and the next morning, but out of obligation he made his way up the hill late in the afternoon. He was surprised to see a colonist leaving the clinic and a group of colonists milling around outside in the plaza. There were so many that they had set up shade sails on the columns. Despite the presence of so many people, no one else seemed to be entering the clinic. Good afternoon, Director Waters, one of the colonists said from the shade with the tip of his hat as Waters passed. Waters nodded in acknowledgement and entered the shelter to see the screen pulled aside and Jazzy sitting there. She leaned against a table and rubbed her forehead. She looked exhausted. It looks like you had a patient, Waters said. I've had 16 patients, Jazzy replied. 16? That's fantastic, Waters said. At last, a result that we can show in our report. Is it? Is it fantastic? Jazzy asked with frustration. What do you mean? That's more than twice as many patients as we've had in all the months up till now. Jazzy looked up, exasperated. Not one of them needed any treatment. From old to young, every one of them is the picture of health. They weren't here for treatment. Did you examine them? Every one. And none of them needed treatment? Not a one. Then why on earth were they here? I have heard about Jesus more today than in my entire life, including the required Mufasa course on comparative religions. You mean they were here to convert you? That's exactly why they were here. Every one of them sat patiently through my exam, babbling all the while, asking if I had read the Gospels. Of course I have not. Everyone knows it's on the DID's cautionary list. I wouldn't touch that book if you bashed me in the head with it, she said, removing a pair of latex exam gloves and tossing them into a wastebasket with more force than was necessary. And where were you? How was I supposed to handle a mob of colonist proselytizers? You were supposed to be here to do your job. We're supposed to be educating them, Alex. Waters and Jazzy narrowed their eyes, but they were spared another argument when Tommy burst in. The Li-Fi is working.